Good morning. Welcome back from spring break. I'm glad some of you could get out of bed on time to come to this 10 o'clock session um, uh, of our conference on media, religion, and the future of civic dialogue. My name is David Scott. I'm a communication professor here at Utah Valley University, and I'm here to introduce our next speaker. Before I do, for those of you who are students receiving credit or extra credit for attendance today, if you look on the walls, there are QR codes for you to scan, which will then link you to a space where you can log in and sign in with your professor's name, and then that information will be sent to your professor for you. Standing beside me here is Dr. Kristin Peterson. She is Associate Professor of Communication at Boston College, where she teaches courses related to the intersection of media and religion. Her book, Unruly Souls: The Digital Activism of Muslim and Christian Feminists, published by Rutgers in 2022, examines how digital spaces facilitate intersectional feminist activism within evangelical Christian and Muslim American communities. She is a board member of the International Society of Media, Religion, and Culture, and she is also a member of the Board of Representatives for the Boston Consortium for Graduate Students in Gender, Culture, Women, and Sexuality. Please welcome her with a hand.
Thank you all for coming. I know it's early after spring break. I'll try to keep it engaging with a lot of examples. Thank you also to the hosts for welcoming me and the great hospitality. I did my graduate school in University of Colorado in Boulder, so it's nice to be back in the mountains. Although I forgot about having chapstick and lotion all the time. I've had kind of gotten over that in Boston. But so my presentation today, I'm going to kind of have two parts to it. So the first part, I'm going to look at some previous research that I've done and case studies that have looked at how digital media has been a space for activism within religious communities. And then I want to look a little bit more at current research, but kind of more forward looking with a focus on like what we've seen that has changed in the last 10 years or so in terms of digital media, in terms of the platforms, and in particular algorithms and the polarization that came up at the end of the last presentation. And so my training is in digital media studies and religious studies, and my work has generally looked at how those who've been marginalized from religious communities have used media spaces, digital media, and the creativity, the flexibility of these spaces to really speak back and to develop activism and community. And so if we look back to around 2010s or so, this was a period when there was a lot of discussion about digital media, right? There was the Arab Spring, Facebook activism, Twitter activism. We had later on Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And there was a lot of discussion around how these might be spaces for politics. And we see a lot of examples, right, of how this was playing out. And there was a lot of commentary around that time about if this is really activism or if it's like slacktivism, like or clicktivism or some of these phrases, right? But I kind of take the perspective that other scholars, Zizi Papacherisi is one example, talks about this, Lynn Schofield Clark as well. This idea that digital media is not necessarily political activism in and of itself, but it can be a place for people to feel themselves into larger stories, right? So if you think about something like Me Too, even the name of it is this idea of like, yeah, me too. I also have a connection experience with that. But also thinking about Black Lives Matter, you might not relate personally to that experience, but you might say, I can empathize, I can understand this, and this movement helps me think about this in a different way. And that can hopefully lead into larger political activism, right? And so that's a lot of the framing that I do in my work. I'm also really influenced by work from Stuart Hall and some of these more decolonial, queer theory, thirdness theories, right? People who are sort of in between or marginalized, and how they've used the creativity of digital media to kind of speak back to those experiences. And so I'll talk about some of these in my presentation, but my work in the book kind of looks at that in terms of people who are hurt by things like the purity culture, and we'll talk about Muslim Americans as well. So it was a nice lead-in with the last presentation. Okay, so we'll kind of talk through, like I said, a few examples, and then I want to look at some more recent issues. So the first example I want to talk about is a case that happened actually over 10 years ago now. So I'm feeling a bit old talking about this, but I was in grad school, really active on Twitter at that time. And I remember evening, I think it's around February, the early February in 2015. This image started to circulate on my Twitter feed, and I thought, well, this is interesting. What is this? What is this picture? As you can see here, two women wearing hijab and a young man. And then pretty soon after, this kind of image was created. And so I don't know if people were familiar with this case at all, but basically to kind of give you a brief background of what happened was these three young people lived in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a big area, a large Muslim population, but also, it's the Research Triangle, lots of universities, and they were students living in a big apartment complex, and their neighbor came over, just basically shot them. And the initial media reports were that it was over a parking dispute. And this is what the police said, this was what the media said. And pretty soon after, people were really activated on social media to say, this is not what this was about. And they were saying this was about three Muslims who were killed out of hatred. And there was evidence that the person who'd committed the crime did have really anti-religious ideas in his life. And it came out later on that it was not a parking dispute. Their cars were not parked anywhere near the spots. So, and so these images started to circulate. This is another image as well. And so what I look at in my work on this is the way that like affect and emotion circulated along with these images, right? And so it did have, in this case, it did have the effect that it moved people, right? Both Muslims and non-Muslims to feel for these lives and to see these as lives that were worthy of value and mourning, and that they were American lives. And these young people, I could go on and on. They were incredible people, served, did amazing things in their community. And there was a lot of documents of this because they were very online. So there was videos and photos and all of these things, right? So there was nothing you could say that was like bad about them, right? But the thing I look at in the article I did on this is that they had to do so much work, their family members and their friends, to prove that these were lives that were valued. And it kind of gets to the last question of like, how does the media represent religion? And this is the consequence, right? That people would see these lives as anything, as anything but young American lives that were lost. That's a tragedy. And then this is just a little plug if you're interested in learning more. This is a documentary called 36 Seconds, and it was created by a young man. It's an excellent documentary. I've done screenings at my university of this, and you can rent it on Apple and Amazon and all those places. So it gives you a background on the case. But what I'm looking at in terms of the media aspect is like the way that emotion circulated around this case and how that caused people to feel for these lives, but also to think about the labor that goes into this work, right? The labor that certain religious communities have to do to prove their lives are valuable. Another case that I've looked at is I did a project where I compared the Church Too movement with the Mosque Me Too movement. And these are two examples of, or a few examples of the people who kind of started these two movements. And what I think about in these two movements is the way that this was ability to use the hashtag to show a larger collective movement, right? And for people to share their own experiences. But importantly, in both of these cases, you have to consider the way that these young people or people in general were kind of turning around the religious language that often was used to shame, particularly women. You're not covered enough, you're not modest enough. That's why you're being harassed or abused, right? And in these cases, the participants in these hashtags were often using religious language to say, I am valued, I I do, I was covered fully in the during the Hajj, the most sacred religious ceremony, and I still was groped, right? So what's the reason for that, right? And so these are some of the projects that um, some examples of the ways that people are sort of speaking back, right? Similar in my book project, I look at the Kiss Shame Buy movement. I don't know, is anyone familiar with this book? I don't know if this makes the circulation around, but this was a very popular book within evangelical communities. And it's you know, it's a key work within the kind of purity culture movement and was extremely harmful for a lot of people, particularly in the evangelical community. And a really active Twitter thread started around 2015, 16 or so. There was a lot of conversations of people talking about how harmful these teachings were to their lives and ways to kind of reverse those teachings and celebrate your sexuality, celebrate who you are, and move away from the shame-based teachings. So one example, this is Matthias Roberts. He had this, this is kind of just a quippy thing, but he said, I kiss straight in goodbye, right? So in this example, you can see the kind of playfulness of language that Twitter used to have, where people could kind of play with these things, right? And kind of and sort of express their own experiences in this way that's humorous, right? These are a few other examples of, there's a lot of different tweets that were very active at that time. I want to show you one other example. This is from a campaign that a woman named Linda K. Klein did, and she wrote a book as well about purity culture. And she did this project where people could submit postcards where they would write their stories, and then if she would get their permission, and she'd share them on Instagram. So in this example, what I really like about this is the way that this person, who identifies as Sarah, talks about how the religious teaching was used to denigrate her experience, but then how this is a space for them to using religious language to reclaim their value. So she talks here about my God, my relationship with him taught me that I am fearfully and wonderfully made in his image. God is love, and so am I. And so you see here how it's like I was taught this, but I've come to realize that I can use these ideas and I can express my own value and my own idea of being created flawlessly by God. Okay, so I'm going to move to another case study. I've spent a lot of time looking at Muslim American experience, and in particular, the ways that visual platforms have been really effective for Muslim Americans, not only to kind of contest these dominant misrepresentations, particularly for Muslim women that they're victimized, they're passive, they're oppressed, but also how this can be a space for them to play and to create spaces of meaning for themselves, right? And so this is one example of a woman that I've looked at her work, Leah Vernon, and she identifies as a fat Black Muslim woman, and she uses her Instagram page to really visually contest what is accepted as beautiful and consequently whose lives are valued. So she uses her images to counteract what she calls the pastel social media aesthetic of Muslim fashion influencers. So if you do a search on Instagram of Muslim fashion, like you're probably going to see similar kind of styles, and you're not going to see this. So she really is trying to kind of counteract that with her work. But another important thing that she does is not only like using her body to really like take up space and really like claim her ability to speak, but she also talks about issues that aren't often talked about in social media spaces, and particularly at that time. She talks about things like, fat phobia, racism, Islamophobia, but also things like mental health and struggles she's had with that in a way that I think is very authentic. I know now some influencers are really into talking about mental health, um, but she would talk even about like the hustle culture of being an influencer and how difficult it is. Okay, another example I want to look at or show you is the work of Zainab bint Yunus. So this is her on the right. She, as you can see, is what you call a niqabi. She wears a niqab face veil, and she's in Canada. And she uses Instagram in a really interesting way in that Um, well, first of all, she never shows her face. She doesn't show her face in public, obviously, but she also never really shows herself in any way. Most of her Instagram page is pictures either of her home or pictures of books, and she does like book reviews. And she does these Muslim book reviews. So she looks at different things, children's book, or here it's a fantasy book series. She covers lots of different things. Um, but what I think is really notable about her work is she creates these like beautiful images that not only are like the domestic space, but are kind of like the Islamic domestic space. So she kind of celebrates the Islamic style, like you can see here. Um, and and so I think what's interesting is she's using this platform of Instagram that is really kind of this homey domestic platform, and she's using it in that way, but she's using it in a kind of a subversive way because she's using it in a way to be like, I'm not going to show myself, right? I'm going to show my baked goods and I'm going to show my book reviews and my home, but I'm also always going to talk about Islam because that's important to me. And so that's going to be kind of the basis. And I'm going to celebrate Islamic styles. So I think that's really interesting about her work as well. Okay, I feel like I'm rushing through. Take a breath. Okay, we're going to look at a video. All right. So in my book, I talk a little bit about hip hop and hip hop music as this layered space, right? Because if you know anything about hip hop music, it's a lot about, sampling, right? So you borrow from different music, but also the lyrics are really playful and creative. And I think that because of that, and a lot of people have written about this, it's allowed, people who have marginalized people from the beginning to speak back, right? And to have this space of expression. And interestingly, um, hip hop music in these two cases that we'll look at has been really fruitful space for Muslim Americans. And I think it's partly because they come from this third space, this third experience, because a lot of them are children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants, immigrants themselves. And so they have kind of their foot in these different worlds that they're very much American, but they also have these cultural backgrounds. And in both of these cases, we'll see how they're kind of playing with these things, right? They're very American, but they're also um, celebrating their culture and their religion as well. Um, and I think this is a really interesting space to do this work that Homi Bhabha, who's a decolonial scholar, talks about these ideas of mimicry, which is kind of like mimicking, copying Western culture, but then using it in your own way and inserting your own like critique of Western culture into that space. And so we'll look at a couple examples here. But what I think is interesting is that what they're doing is not so much saying, "Oh, like look at us, we're Americans, we're not terrorists," but instead what they're doing is they're saying like, "This is who we are. Like we're using this space to be creative, express ourselves. We're not trying to prove anything, right? We're just who we are." And so let's look at a few this example. And now this is Mona Hayder. You maybe have heard of her perhaps. She was really well known. She had this video called Hijab, Wrap My Hijab. Maybe you've seen that one. And this video is called Barbarian. I think it's one of her best videos and work. And so she's a hip hop artist, um, Arab origin. I can't remember if it's her family's from Syria, but she does really, really cool creative work. And I want you to just watch this, look at the different ways that she's kind of doing this layering in this work. Hopefully the sound works good. I'll bump it up loud.
If they're civilized, I'd rather stay savage. We them barbarians, beautiful and scaring them, earth shaking, rattling, be wild out loud again. We them barbarians, jasmine and frankincense, feminine invading them, beautiful barbarians. Say it again, beautiful barbarian. Say it again, Beautiful barbarian. Say whatever you wear, I sin. We don't like to learn. We beautiful barbarians. Let me think back. I remember days on these big lips. Oh, they used to hate. Now the script flip. Oh, hey, they got a lip kit. Kylie J. 100 real talk. That's what I'm on. If I'm a savage, then you're a fraud. My chain's off. Won't be long. See me glowing. Look at God. So fresh and so eloquent. I keep it humble and elegant. Your beauty standard irrelevant. A revolution is so imminent. We keep it joyful and better when I see my mama as evidence. Nobody needs your benevolence. What? Feminist planet is imminent. We them barbarians. All right, I'll stop it there. I'm impressed with the captioning. It got most most of it. I should have put the captions up there for you. But as you can see here, both visually and in the lyrics, she's really celebrating various cultures. And she told me that this is great that it stops in this image, but she told me that the participants, she said, bring the clothes that represent your cultural background. So the people who are in the video, they dressed in the way that they wanted to represent their experience. And you can see how she's really celebrating and embracing the negative stereotypes that get applied to Muslim bodies, savage, exotic, barbarian. But at the same time, it's pointing out the flaws in white European culture, right? And it even talks later on about, you're going to start a war over oil fields, talking about the beauty standards, oh, well, now, you want the big lips, now you want the big butt, and then the next day you're going to move on, right? And so it's kind of critiquing and making a commentary on that while also celebrating the the barbarian culture, quote unquote. And that's really this mimicry concept, right? You can see that here. The other example to look at is the Mipsters movement. So Mipsters came to be really popular. I think 2012, they released a video that was this like fashion video. It's like the Muslim hipsters, right? And then more later on, they became more sophisticated. And I interviewed a couple of the creators behind it, and they had these really sophisticated ideas around what they were doing by creating this video project, fashion, images, art, and they wanted this to be focused around this idea of Muslim futurism. And so kind of building on Black futurism or Afrofuturism, if you know about those concepts. And so in this video, we'll look at a little bit of the clip. They're also using hip hop music, and the music itself is really kind of layering Arab beats, Muslim prayers with, kind of contemporary hip hop culture. And similar, they told the participants, choose whatever you want to wear, and they talked about how it was kind of this like, your grandma's closet kind of, raid your grandma's closet, find cool trendy things you want to wear. And so you see in this video as well, we'll look at it, there's really this hybridity and in betweenness of the young people in the video and really kind of expressing, who they are, right? So let's look at 38, okay. We'll look at a few minutes of this video. This is called Alhamdu.
Don't forget about Karbala. The 4 days of the gram, man, we were blazing the grams, and that had my grades in the jam. Real talk, y'all was straining my fam. Damn, losing trust put crazy in the man. Pops tripping, raising his hands. Mom's in it, glazing the yams. That's the homies I race in the van, lacing my van. Now you see sunshine, right? Matador steeds let the bullshit pass. Campuses where full clip blasts, expensive books in the bullshit class. Hey, can't lie though, so many coffee, cream, macchiato, women, I just hit the lotto. MSA was on my boggle, I was tripping off bravado. I ain't know the time of auto. Rap was picking up full throttle, falling off my studies auto. Mom's on the phone crying, she don't want me to drop out. No. She ain't moved to the States for a son to be a broke and a joke and a cop out. Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. This not no America. Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. We coming to your area.
Okay. You actually might see Leah Vernon's in the video too. So there's a lot of intersections between a lot of these different movements. But as you can see, similar to the Barbarian video, They're really embracing Orientalist stereotypes in an effort to showcase their beauty. And they were interested in engaging with futurist themes. And two of the creators, Abbas Ratani and Sarah Alfagi, they defined Muslim futurism as, quote, a cultural and artistic aesthetic that reimagines an American Muslim future free from the confines of Orientalism and the language of the majority culture, end quote. And so I think this project really allows Muslims to exist and to create something that's for their own enjoyment and not to always be speaking back to these dominant misrepresentations. And I think this idea of futurism is really productive because it allows, again, this idea of like breaking free from these binaries and creating outside of the kind of the boxes. Okay. The other thing I want to look at briefly is podcasts. So I've always been fascinated by podcasts as an interesting space that you can explore questions of religion and faith and meaning in a deeper level. And these are a few examples of some podcasts that I think kind of had their moment a while ago, but in the early days of podcasting were really prominent. So Evangelical was a really big community for former evangelicals. Queerology is run by Matthias Roberts, who I mentioned before with the tweet. And it's a really cool podcast where he does these interviews with people. And it's kind of getting beyond the question of can you be queer and blank, like LDS, Muslim, whatever. And he's saying, no, like, how do you live your life as a queer Muslim person, a queer Baptist, whatever it is, right? And then the Liturgist podcast was a kind of this creative space, really experimental podcast space. But the one I want to talk about briefly is this podcast called Truth's Table. It's hosted by these three women here, and they're African American women who are all trained within the kind of theological tradition. They're Protestant, and the podcast, I talk about it in the book. It's kind of this space that allows for these women to really build up and to dialogue and to build up their own understanding of Christianity that's centered on Black women's experience. And this is really building on womanist theology, womanist traditions, which is to build up theology based on your own experiences, in particular the experiences of Black women. And so they talk in the podcast, they'll say, pull up a seat, because the show is called Truth's Table. So they'll say, pull up a seat to the table, get out your tea, join us, right? So it creates a sense of connection and intimacy of the podcast. And it creates this space of dialogue. And this builds on something that Bell Hooks talks about, this long tradition of dialogue being this powerful space for Black women to speak back and to build, new understandings. There's a lot I could say about this, but I think just in general, podcasts are a really fruitful space in particular, and I think still to kind of have these discussions. And I'll just go show you one quote from one of the podcasts. One of the hosts, Ekemini, talks about, again, this kind of work to use this platform, similar like I said with Twitter, to use the platform, use the space to speak back and to re-articulate one's value, particularly in the eyes of God. And so in this quote, she talks about, we don't value Black life in this country. It angers me to no end because we are made in the image of God. That's why we really have to derive our worth from the scriptures, from Jesus Christ himself, and then saying, because nobody else is going to give that to us. And this is a really great episode where they talk about, the kind of the worshiping of whiteness that happens in a lot of churches, that, you have the Black Jesus, you have white Jesus, white imagery, that whiteness in some ways is kind of deified. And so they're doing a lot of work here of talking about that, right? And breaking this down. Okay. All right. So I want to talk about where we are now. I kind of talked about some examples that I've done before. And I think there was this particular moment, both within digital media, and we'll talk about what's shifted there, but also I think within religions. So I feel like a lot of what we were seeing was really a millennial movement, the millennial generation, particularly if you think about, purity culture. A lot of people, my generation, came up within that community, and there was a lot of shame and hurt that was created. And around 2010s or so, people were coming of age. They were starting to get married, date, and they were like, this was messed up. And they started to talk to people about this, right? In Twitter and Facebook groups and podcasts. And then I think what happened was that kind of helped them, right? It created comfort. It created a sense of like, no, it's okay, and they helped to create and find community. But then I think people got married, had kids, started their lives, and were less, we're not active in those spaces anymore, right? So I think those spaces were important in a moment, but then they kind of moved on, right? And people moved to other things in their lives, right? But also I think we see that the media landscape has changed, right? And I want to talk about that for the rest of the discussion today, to think about what has changed, right? So actually, I'll maybe ask. I can't make it super interactive. I know there's not the microphone, but what's changed, do you think, from my talking about 2015, Twitter discussions, Facebook groups, Instagram pictures? What do we think is different now? An AI? Yep. Algorithms. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like an inundate. Yeah, so much. And also I think like the commercialization of podcasts. Yeah. Individuality. Yep, definitely. Anything else you want to add? I think these are all good points. Yeah. So yeah, I think the biggest thing I see is the personalized algorithm, right? And I think TikTok in particular, right? Because I've been doing interviews with young women about content they're consuming, and a lot of them will say that they use Instagram and TikTok, everybody. And they'll say, I go to Instagram mostly because I like to see what my friends are up to. I like to look at different people I follow. And they're like, I go to TikTok because I just like to see what like comes up. What's going to be on my feed, right? I don't follow anybody on there. I just want to see the feed, right? And maybe this relates to people. So I think there's something different with TikTok where it's this personal experience and this kind of idea that the algorithm is powerful and it's going to give you something that you're meant to see, right? Um, but then I also think there's this hyper visual, hyper fastness of everything, right? That it's, you know, people are always looking at it on their phones. So I take, the shuttle at my campus. We have a little shuttle that goes to campus, or I take the bus, and I'm always just like so anxious when I look at people because they're just like, and everything's going on like 2 times speed, and it's everything is fast, right? Everything is visual, fast. You see it, you forget it, you move on, right? Um, and and I think, how do you talk about religion in a space where it's fast and visual? Like it's hard to think about, some of these deep topics. Like, where is the space for that, right? And then we see everything gets pushed to extremes, right? Because we want it to spread. So it has to be the most extreme, right? And we know it's like anger mostly, whatever is going to make people upset. And then the misinformation, and I think the AI kind of goes hand in hand with that now, because we have so much of this AI created content that, again, is meant to fit into this visual, extreme, fast, personalized, right? Okay, so I think those are some of the things. And the end goal, we'll talk about this with a few examples, is not about connecting people, right? Like, if we think about like so a lot of ex-evangelical communities started on private Facebook groups, and those were really important for people, or even blogging before then, right? Or if we think about the Twitter hashtags, right? That was a space that connected people. They were like, oh, these people all around the world are talking about this, right? We don't really have that anymore. That it's mostly, consuming, consuming stuff, entertaining stuff, keeping you on the platform. And it's generally meant to give you more and more of what you like, reinforce your ideas, prove that the other side is wrong and your side is right. So it's not about, if we're thinking about civic discourse and dialogue, it's not about that. It's about, as we'll talk about, you talk about, it's about dunking on the others, right? It's not about actually thinking about how can we work together, cross differences to create something, right? Okay, so it's quite depressing, but let's dig into it, because I want to talk about at the end, hopefully, where can we find spaces of hope, potential, possibilities. So this is a recent article. You all probably are like, I'm not going to read this unless somebody tells me to read it. But really great article, Zalia Volchik and Mark Andreevich. And it was in this journal called Cultural Studies, called Automated Media and Commercial Populism. But it's been really influential for my recent work. And they talk about things we know, right? They're talking about algorithms and how algorithms push us into these bubbles, these polarized bubbles. They talk about algorithms as automated curation of social media. So I think that's a huge shift that we're seeing, right? Because it's no longer who you follow, what you like, which again is going to be biased to what you like, but you might see something that might pop up that is different from your friend, right? But now it's saying it's just giving you what the algorithm has determined it wants to give you. And the platforms are not being set up to promote discussions across differences, but are designed to give you more and more targeted content, right? So we know this is what's happening. So I thought they had a really good quote here, particularly because the theme of this conference is civil discourse or civic discourse. And they talk about this concept of uncivic discourse. And so it says an unwillingness to concede the forms of mutual societal interdependence that might serve as the basis for a shared sense of a public interest or common good. So when I read that, I immediately thought, and maybe this crowd is too young for this, I immediately thought about the community Facebook groups. If anybody has the pleasure or horror of being in one of these groups, I think you'll see this, right? So for example, in my neighborhood in Boston, there's been recently a discussion about should we turn this old former senior home, nursing home into a family shelter. Oh my goodness. There's people on both sides, and the Facebook group is crazy about this, and you get all the different, people come out, right? But when you look at the discussions, it's not really a discussion. It's mostly, this is what I think, this is what I think. Ugh, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And it's just people going after each other and often like going after each other, right? And it gets really nasty. And you see this and you're like, this is not civic discourse, right? The goal is not to say, okay, we have a housing shortage, right? This seems like a good idea of like, let's think about what we can do to address the housing shortage. Maybe this particular building is not the best solution, but we should come together and talk about what might be the best solution, right? And that's not what we see happening. Okay. So we know the platforms are focused on money, right? They're focused on bringing in more money, more advertising, more people to the platforms, and they're not focused on civic discourse. But also the social media platforms are meant to get content to spread. And so we have here a quote, a flow of short, quick hits that provoke peak interest and entertain, posts that get a reaction and perhaps mobilize a response. So this is what spreads, what people are trying to aim for, right? And again, if you say, well, is this the best space, the best format for talking about religion, for talking about social issues? Not necessarily, right? This is what's going to get things to spread. Okay, so they talk about this concept of commercial populism. And in this article, they're focused on the far right and the ways that prominent figures on the right are promoting, far right populist ideas. But also, as we see here, you have someone like Alex Jones who's also promoting stuff. It's not just about his ideas, but it's buy these products, buy my whatever it is, my special plan or whatever, spend money, right? And they talk about how there's like a right-wing version of health and wealth or prosperity gospel where they're promoting these products and way of life so that you can also be successful and healthy like them. But what's interesting is a few years back, I read a really good article in the New York Times by the author's named Molly Young. And it was talking about this woman, her name's Amanda Chantel Bacon, and she's a wellness guru. And she is, like a typical wellness guru, granola, earthy, all this kind of stuff. And she has this company called, I think, Moon Juice or something. And she has a store and she sells stuff. And there was an interesting note in the article that said sometimes she promotes the same supplements that Alex Jones promotes. And I thought that's interesting, right? That they're on the complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. What they're talking about is very different, but they're promoting the same products. And in some ways, they're promoting the same thing, right? Which is like the world is really, there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of precarity, there's a lot of anxiety, and we have the answer for you, right? And I think that's a lot of what we see. We'll talk about trad wives in a little bit, but I think that's a lot of what we see in a lot of this content, which is everything's really messed up and we have the answer. We have the stuff that you can buy that will solve your problem and you'll be like us. But I think it's interesting to compare these two because they're both standing in the same way and but very different ideas. Okay. And then I had one more thing I wanted. I have a few examples, so I'm running out of time. But does anyone do you all get this newsletter, Believing? Do you get this, Joel? Yeah. Yeah, this is great. And just like yesterday, the Sunday newsletter, which is a really good newsletter about religion. So if you're not getting it, definitely sign up for it. The author is I'm forgetting the name of the author, but Lauren Jackson. And just yesterday, she wrote about this new Netflix documentary on the manosphere by Louis Theroux. And this is her quote, so I'm not gonna I just quoted right from it. But she says here that in the documentary, Thoreau is talking with this manosphere influencer Harrison Sullivan, and he says like, why not try to be a good person, uplift people, don't pander to their worst impulses, actually encourage them to make the right choices. And so said, just for a moment, Sullivan's bravado fades. He said, if I had just done good things, I never would have really blown up on social media in the first place, right? And then this is another example of another influencer. And this person says, I'm trying to make a buck selling ideologies, right? And so I think this is kind of the context we're in, where it's all about, selling ideas and selling extreme ideas, right? And selling really pushing people to these extremes. And I think there's two examples I want to look at, I think relate to this. So one is trad wives. And the reason why I think about this is because I was talking about before the anxieties of the current moment. And I've been talking with interviewing young women about content they consume. And none of these women are conservative or traditional in any way, but they all often would mention trad wives. They would come up, they would watch them, they would be fascinated by them. And I'd kind of be like, well, what's going on there? And it often seemed like they were really comforted by this kind of these feminine gender roles, that there was these clear roles of like, you get married, you have a husband, you have a family, you have a beautiful home. Like there's a comfort in that, right? I should give you the example. So obviously we have our Utah person here, Anna Nealman, and then also another LDS, Nara Smith, but she's in New York. So she does more like chic kind of content. And so these women are really like, they're tapping into the Instagram aesthetic, right? The pleasing content, the desire that young women want to live in these successful lives, have attractive husbands, perfect children. But they're still promoting conservative ideas at the end of the day. But I really feel like mostly what they're doing is the same thing as the wellness gurus. They're all doing the same thing. The messaging might be slightly different, but the end goal is buy our stuff, right? Keep following us, buy our stuff. And also for women, you're responsible for your own happiness, right? You have to figure it out. This is the message that they're promoting, right? So the pressure is on women. And the last thing I want to talk about is the work of Blair Imani. So I did an article about her, and she is here. I'll show you what she looks like. She's kind of one of these like progressive content creators who does a lot of like education content. So just these short videos. She talks about, her stuff is good. It's all, education based content, right? There's nothing necessarily wrong about it. But her content is really framed around this idea of like she's educating people, she's informing people, and you're like, that's great. But when you look at her content and you look at the comments and you see, you see kind of the type of content it is, and the reality of Instagram. Her content is not getting fed to a conservative, far right manosphere guy, right? It's getting fed to people who are already kind of primed for that content, right? So in a lot of ways, somebody might see the video and they might say, oh, I didn't really know very much about rainbow washing, right? But they're already kind of into that content, right? So my point that I'm trying to make in the article is that what she's doing is not really like educating the unwashed masses. Instead, she's creating content for the pleasure of people who already agree with her, right? And I was really inspired by a work from Miriam Cook, where she talks about this idea of cyber atomism and kind of how this hyper individualistic that came up, hyper digital society, that there's pleasure that we get from the clicks and the views and affiliating ourselves with a particular political side. And so she said, in an atomized society, individuals are held together by terror, but in a cyber atomistic society, desire and pleasure provide the glue, quote unquote. In the political polarized space of social media, pleasure comes not only in liking content from your side, so liking her post, but also distinguishing yourself from the other side, right? And the reason why I talk about this in her work is that what I found by doing a content analysis was that a lot of her top posts, like most liked, most viewed, were actually had negative emotions. Like, and I was like, that's interesting. Like, why would people like these videos if they're have more negative emotions? And they were often kind of sarcastic negative emotions. And they were usually targeted at particular people or groups. So some of her most popular posts would have anger at companies that would co-opt progressive causes, like we see here with the rainbow washing, or disdain for religious leaders who make harmful pronunciations about queer people, as you see in this post. And also, a lot of her posts were about language use and frustration with people who refuse to use, educate themselves and use proper language, right? And so in all of these posts, she kind of has a bit of sarcasm, a bit of ire, anger at targeted towards something, right? But the viewers don't respond of like, oh, you hurt my feelings. No, they respond of like, yeah, that's right, in support of that, right? And in some ways, kind of defining like, yeah, I'm not part of those people. I know the right word to use. I know that this is this issue, right? So this was kind of an interesting discovery that there was much more of this idea of pleasure in being part of the group and not part of that other quote unquote group. Okay. Um, I kind of ran out of most time, but I had just kind of some questions to think about, and I can also take other questions too. We can bring this up later on in the panel. But we want to think about, how does this age of algorithms, polarization, AI, how does this harm religious discourse? What are spaces? Where are these spaces for in-depth civic discussions? Is it still podcasts, or have those become too much, too corporatized? Um, Also, like, where are places where people can connect without being surveilled? I feel like that's more and more of an issue now, right? It's like, how can we collectively come together, but without this fear that we're going to be surveilled? And then, do we see more activism moving into offline spaces? Um, or also more hybrid spaces? I was thinking about how, like, all sorts of like intersectional feminist activism often relies on kind of this using creative hybrid spaces, as I talked about, to resist. So where are some of those spaces? Overall, just thinking about how, the speed of these spaces, the polarization, this idea of like you're just dunking on the other, like, is that really a productive space for us to talk about social change, talk about religion? And, I often think about this too, like, we have a very popular, I should say we, in the Catholic Church tradition, that's my background. There's like a popular Catholic priest, on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and it's like, is that like the best space to talk about deep political, but it could deep religious topics, but it could be a good space for people to learn. But you'd hope that then they would go deeper than that, right? Than just watching a quick video. So those are some kind of questions that I have. I'm at the time, so we can, I don't know if we want to take a couple questions, or otherwise we can kind of wrap, use my time up. Thank you very much. Sure. And we can talk more in the panel.
I'd love for you to talk about the hope.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
where are the hopeful spaces after we've just learned about all of
I know.
this?
I feel like it's really, there's not a lot of hope right now. Well, I do feel like there's hope in what we're seeing going on in communities, activated by different things that are happening. And I think there's a lot more, I feel, and I don't know if this is just me, I feel people are a lot more community engaged than they used to be. I think people are more like meeting in real life, talking to people, wanting to like have having community discussions and meetings and engaging, um, and organizing, doing food distribution and talking to your neighbors. And I've seen a lot more of that. I feel like people are more activated on like, if we want real social change, we have to actually talk to people in real life. um, but that the yeah, right. Yeah. But these are can be good, useful tools, right? That we can use to kind of organize, but that real activism needs to happen offline. That's where I find hope. Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to know your opinion on moderation and censorship within online spaces about political and religious discourse.
Yeah. So like whether the platforms themselves should moderate, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there should, well, my thinking on this is that the platforms kind of want to have it both ways, right? They want to have the privilege of Section 230 and not have to do anything. But they also want to have their algorithms that are going to privilege the content they want to privilege, right? So it's like you can't really have it both ways, right? You can't like structure the platform in one way and then say, oh, but we're not going to moderate the content, right? So I feel like the platforms and the way the algorithms are causing all these problems and are causing, the extremist content, right, to spread. So I mean, I think there's, yeah, I think we need platforms that are more open source and more, don't have the algorithms are created by people. And obviously I think there should be some moderation in terms of like certain things that are like explicit and harmful and things like that. But overall I think that, yeah, like I said, I think the moderation that they're pushing is more to like cover their butts in some way because they're getting so much pressure. But I don't think it's meant to create civic dialogue, right? So that's, yeah. Because I think the line I always felt like with the First Amendment was always, oh well, the good stuff will rise to the top, right? Like if you don't have, um, you don't need to moderate because like people will know like those are like people who believe the Earth is flat are like nobody will believe that and the good stuff will rise up. But I think because of the algorithms, then that creates a problem, right? So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but generally I think no, you shouldn't necessarily moderate, especially if things are free speech protected. But I also think that the way the platforms are is they're promoting some of this really more harmful misinformation. It's complicated.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if you would consider, someone like myself part of the problem. Say like, I think of, organizations, well, maybe I won't name them, but there'll be some like political organizations that'll like hold the prove me wrong
Ah,
things, like
yeah,
those booths on
yeah,
campus or whatever. And like where they'll film it
yeah,
and
yeah. I've seen those.
they post the oh so and so roasts
Yeah,
liberals, that sort of thing,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And if- when someone came here last year, right, for that, I just wouldn't have gone, just because I mean they're there to promote their business or
Right.
their following, their
Yeah.
base or whatever. Like I just wouldn't have gone and asked a question, and I
Yeah.
would have just excluded myself from that. So would me excluding myself from going to those like open
Mm,
table debate things, is that kind of a would that be contributing to the problem of digital innovation,
mm.
or would that be like, I don't know, would that be doing the right thing? Because like I
Yeah.
don't know, what do you, I mean,
Well,
if
I'm
that
not
makes
going to
sense, I
judge
don't know.
what you do is good or bad. I've never met you before, but um, but I think I feel like those prove me wrong kind of things are part of this larger ecosystem, right? Because it's all about, the entertainment value, turning civil dialogue into entertainment and, who's right and who's wrong. And rather than having sort of a conversation where you're trying to really respect and like the human dignity discussion in the previous presentation. So you not attending, I don't think there's anything good or bad about that, but perhaps, thinking about like maybe there's better spaces for these kind of dialogues or better formats to have that, because dialogue is good but not necessarily in that way, right? But no, it's a good point to bring those examples up, definitely. I think we have to wrap up because we've got to get to class. Or
I think that has to
yeah.
be a wrap. Please join me in thanking Kristin. Okay, we'll take a quicker 5-minute break before our next session. Again, for those students who came in late, there are QR codes on the sides of the room so that you can sign in and get credit or extra credit or whatever deal you had with your professor.